Good evening. The news gang is here, and tonight the president's big speech at Parliament. Oh, was it? The opposition cheerleaders up in the gallery, the deputy president's supporters upbeat, and the Mwananchi left asking for more. Also tonight, the numerous questions about the number, Huduma number, Mpango wa Kando 666, and everything in between. But the news gang appears not to be fully constituted, but on the contrary, I think we are. And we can actually now go to Washington, D.C. That is where Linus Kaikai is tonight, where he's on assignment. Bwana Kaikai, how is everything going on there? Because State of the Nation, State of the Union, what can you tell us about that? That is where it all started, no?
That's right. We borrowed that from here, right here in the United States. And I'm seated in the library of the National Democratic Institute, very rich with that history of 84 speeches so far made between the year 1913 and 2019. Donald Trump is the latest to make that speech. It is traditionally made to the joint houses of Parliament or Congress here. That's the Senate and the House of Representatives, where the president reports the state of the nation. And there's a line we borrowed, and we use it all the time. I've seen the president using it even today. The state of the nation is strong.
Yes.
That was started right here. The state of the union is strong.
All right, great. And we'll see just how strong the state of the nation is over here. We'll come back to you in a few moments. But let's listen to what the president said right after he said the state of the nation is strong.
Honorable members, I must say that I've been under pressure that who am I sacking? But no. But I must, however, caution that the pursuit of the corrupt will be undertaken strictly within the remits of the law. It will not be done through vigilante justice and pitchfork protest. Though media narratives rally our resolve as they should, our actions will not be based on condemnation before one has been heard.
But Agashuri, were you expecting something else, like what the president is saying, to fire somebody?
I didn't expect him to fire anybody. In fact, I think probably the country expected too much from President Uhuru Kenyatta in his State of the Nation address today. Maybe because of what he did in 2015, when at that time he had a list of cabinet secretaries and some senior government officials at that time who had been mentioned in one or the other corruption scandals, and he asked them to step aside. But look at the scenario currently. The current fight against corruption has elicited a lot of reactions and has split the Jubilee administration right down in the middle. So I highly did not expect him to unleash a list of guys that he was going to sack today. But today he has said something that could be very interesting, actually more interesting than what happened in 2015. When the president says, and we will play that bite shortly, that anybody who will be taken to court will have to leave government, that sounds very interesting. Listening to what he was saying a short while ago, that the fight against corruption will not be done in a vigilante style, mob justice style, kinda. And then on the other hand, he says something else, then that introduces a very interesting discussion for NewsGang.
Very interesting. We will revisit that because he appeared to be setting the threshold, because we've been asking, is it when you're mentioned? Is it when you go and write statements at DCI? Now he's saying, no, it is when you actually step in there as an accused person, then you will have to leave. Interesting. Yvonne.
I think...
Did you expect more from the president?
I don't know that I had any expectations. I think I was just very open-minded to see, even though a lot of people said, we want to hear people who have been fired. And then, like we said, that list of shame of 175 from 2015. But he also did talk about, he went on to expound the war on corruption, the Asset Recovery Agency, which he says has investigated 20 cases. They have preserved assets worth 1.1 billion. And he went on to list quite a bit of other things that have been recovered, assets worth 72 million that have been forfeited. Bank accounts that are holding 264 million shillings were frozen, pending determination of recovery proceedings. I think, like you say, there's great expectation, but I actually don't think there's a conflict between what he said about, following the rule of law and no pitchfork protests and, that sort of thing, versus, but listen, if this is something that is mentioned in court, that you will have to step aside. For me, is that a harbinger for what will come next week? Will we now see arrests and charges in court? Because I think now, for me, that's where I would be looking to next week or in the weeks to come.
So did those MPs clap a bit too soon? Because they seem to be quite an excited bunch of them, saying like, yeah, we seem to have our man back.
They kept totally clapping. You could hear the of their feet, especially when you talk about the Building Bridges initiative. But you mentioned expectation, Joe, and before we move on, I'd like to talk about expectations, not just ours, but expectations from Kenyans across the country when they were listening to what the president was saying.
And not Ugandans.
So, Robert, can we hear what Kenyans had to say? We got a few Kenyans speaking to us after the State of the Nation address, and then we'll continue. These are the Vox Pops, the State of the Nation Vox Pops, Kenyans speaking and telling us about what they think of the president's speech. Okay, that we have been told it's coming, but when I listen to the... We have it.
Kitu wa kugusia sana ni hali ya vijana wetu hawana kazi. Lakini hiyo haihusu yeye mwenyewe kuendelea na kazi.
Nilikuwa natarajia ongele mambo ya hii ya njaa yenye na watu huko Turkana. Hajataja maneno, tukiangalia ni watu wengi wanaumia. Pia ukiangalia hii side ya skando, kumekuwa na skando nyingi sana, pesa inaibiwa na watu hawashikwi, ama mtu akishikwa akipelekwa kotini yuapigwa fine halafu yuatoka.
Hatutaki kusikia wimbo leo kesho tangu tulianza kusikia maneno ya corruption na tunajua watu wameiba. Corruption hata kwa county imekuwa too much. Hata kwa hospitali hakuna mandawa, hakuna, watu wameiba yote. Hatutaki kusikia ukiwa wewe ni mgeni ya kinoti pelekwa ndani. Hatutaki kusikia maneno mengine.
Na tungependa yale maneno ametumia kama kwamba ni wafungwe pasipokuwa na ubaguzi, hata kama ni watu wa marafiki zake wa karibu, jamaa zake wote wafungwe.
Ni kile tunataka ni kuona watu ambao wamekamatwa, wamepelekwa kotini, waambiwe walete pesa zao, warudishe pesa. Wakirudisha pesa, hakuna kitu kingine watafungwa.
Handshake tunajua kwanza imetuliza inchi na ikaweza kuleta inchi pamoja.
As you heard, wafungwe
from those fellow Kenyans. So finish and then we will go to Linus in a short while.
In a short while. But you see, you heard them saying what wafungwe, washikwe, mali leiba irudishwe, and there's something that the first person spoke about, hakuzungumzia mambo ya vijana na kazi. And I remember recently it was said that I don't know if he said 500,000, I'm trying to remember exactly what the number was when Matiang'i was speaking about betting and how many young people, 500,000 young people are getting into betting. They're looking for money-making ventures because hakuna kazi. And the country is churning out about 1.5 million youth every year into the job market. So saying, kwa nini rais kuzungumzia hili swala la vijana kutopata kazi? Other than that, you had that corruption. We were expecting more. I was expecting a bit more. And I'm not the only one, as you can hear what the Kenyans were saying.
All right, I think let's speak to Linus now. You must have followed bits and pieces of this thing. Usually it's not very easy to follow all of it there, but I'm sure by now you have a very good idea of what the president said. Were you expecting more than this? Do you think Kenyans who say this was underwhelming have a point?
I was expecting more, and I was expecting the president to quit blowing hot and cold, especially on this issue of corruption. And when the MPs were shouting, Toboa, Toboa, it's because they also expected a little bit more than what they heard. We've had a president that has been getting angry at his cabinet ministers, shouting at them in public events, talking so strongly about corruption. Then everybody says they are listening to the State of the Nation speech to see what direction he gives. What it does instead is the number of curious things. One was the theme that seemed to be running in that speech, no turning back. I didn't see the qualification of that. I mean, no turning back. There's a gospel song by Brandon Heath about not turning back. Then there was also saying, I've heard the cries of our people. Then he proceeds not to do all those things that you've just played right there in the Vox Pops. People talking about things that concern them. Something interesting there when he spoke about the housing scheme, which he sounds like he's progressing with, and says one of the ways it's going to benefit the youth is that the supply of doors and windows will be exclusively retained for, or will be exclusively set aside for the local youth. That's very, very interesting. The youth have been selling those windows, and you know very well the area, for example, around the Eastern Bypass, which a few years ago was empty, is now fully built up, homes and all that, done by the youth, not an initiative of the government. So I think there was more that we expected that didn't come through. Talking of the cabinet ministers that he spoke about, the 2015, Joe, you know, in the village I come from, there used to be a lot of athletics competitions, like there is in the Rift Valley. And one of the runners one time said he didn't finish the 24-lap race, but they kept telling us, but did you see how I started? I was ahead in the first lap. It doesn't matter how you start. Living on the glories of 2015, which I can't even call glory properly, because you remember some of those cabinet ministers that were released are now ambassadors.
But
so
Linus, you don't think that the fact that the president seemed finally to have defined the threshold on the basis of which people step aside, because initially there was this concern about at what point do people really need to step aside. Now he's saying, well, if you are charged in a court of law, then you have to leave government. Isn't that at least something that defines this a bit more than it was before?
No, he's a late comer on that one, because everybody expected that in the first instance. You saw the Director of Public Prosecution, Nordin Haji, expressing frustration during the national conference on anti-corruption at Bomas of Kenya. A lot of people were asking, why would somebody who's been mentioned or taken to court, charged with corruption, still holding a public office? That should have gone without presidential endorsement. It's supposed to be the practice. So on this, he's joining a majority of Kenyans who are already there.
All right.
Back to my point on cabinet ministers, I think releasing them from cabinet but appointing them ambassadors is not a good thing.
All right, Linus, we'll come back to you. Yes, Jamil.
2015. I remember during that State of the Nation address then, there was actually a list of 170 people who were suspects in corruption. 175. Yeah. And until now, none of them have been prosecuted. As he said, some of the cabinet ministers who stepped aside at that time got jobs as ambassadors. In fact, one of them was Charity Ngilu, who was a minister. Yes, and now she's the governor of Kitui. Okay, she was elected, that's fine, but she was one of them. And I think that is important to note. They did
prosecute a few. I'm not sure whether there's been serious
anyone who's been convicted, yes. Yeah. So 175 people on the list. That was in 2015. We expected something like that, but we didn't get it.
I'm looking at it in this context. The allies of Deputy President Dr. William Ruto have been saying something very interesting in the last 3 or so weeks, that the fight against corruption has been fashioned in such a way that it is meant to scuttle his 2022 bid by painting him corrupt. 1. 2, they've been saying that the war against corruption is weaponized to target certain people. Number 3, they've been saying that the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Director of Criminal Investigations have been playing to the gallery. Actually, they have been accusing the DCI of leaking investigation reports to the media for headlines. Now, what the President was saying today is that the government, or he will not have people prosecuted, or he will not have people leave office merely on account of headlines and what he's calling, trial via the media and the whole question of the lynch mob. But, and that's why you saw a lot of foot dumping by MPs allied to the deputy president. Probably they listened to what he was saying on that particular issue, but there's one more line that probably they did not listen to very clearly, that anybody who will be charged will have to leave government. What if next week, and I'm no prophet, but suppose next week 2, 3, 4, 5 cabinet secretaries are charged in court? So Kenyans will remind the president what he said today. So it was more of a question of what members of parliament heard than what they did not hear. Yeah, they probably were clapping and celebrating what they heard the president talk about and not what he did not speak about. In essence, probably he was fattening some guys for slaughter next week.
Yeah, I think so. I'd also like to introduce a different element, because we're making a lot of comparisons between this one and 2015, which a lot of people say is memorable. And one of the things that President Uhuru Kenyatta talked about today was the 10 billion shillings that he, quote, recommitted to healing the wounds of historical grievances which have long been poisoned by our politics and strained communal relations. He even talked about applying the fund to establish symbols of hope across the country, heritage sites. Now, this is the exact
museums.
Yes, the exact same thing he said in 2015. And I quote, this was in March 2015 when he made the State of the Nation then. Remember when he made the big apology for historical injustices? He said, "To move forward as one nation, I stand before you today on my own behalf, that of my government and all past governments, to offer the sincere apology of the government of the Republic of Kenya to all our compatriots for all past wrongs." This was about a day or two after he had received the TJRC report, which to date has not been acted on. And so for me, it's just interesting. He's recommitting that 10 billion, which is supposed to have been done over 3 years, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. Here we are, 4 years later, with a report which, by the way, is unavailable on government sites. You can actually only find it in full at a university in Seattle's website, which is where Professor Ronald Sly, who is one of the former commissioners, actually lectures. And so it just seems interesting that we keep talking about this. He's recommitting to it. How much of this will ever be done? And this might just be one of the legacies that President Uhuru Kenyatta wants to leave behind in terms of,
but in
cohesion.
terms of the 10 billion, I think he was talking about Parliament actually approving it. He was basically saying he's recommitting himself to it, but saying, hey, can you pass it? And
but it really just brings up the TJRC report, something which has not been acted on, and how to address the historical injustices. Some talk about reparation, others are talking about retributive. Okay, the DPP perhaps in terms of evidence, some people are not alive today, but there's deep-seated issues which come up every election. We said never again, and then here we are, 2013, 2017, 2007. A lot of the same things you see, extrajudicial killings and the government being heavy-handed. Those are issues that need to be talked about because they are actually part of Article 10, which is what he's supposed to address himself to in the State of the
national
Nation.
Values. Jamila, as you respond, picking up from what Yvonne had raised about this state of unity in the country and piggybacking on the conversation around the handshake. The president said a lot of things about the handshake, attributing the 6.1 economic growth last year partly to the handshake, but also essentially saying, as he did about many things, that there is no turning back on the handshake. The state of the handshake, where is that, considering the kind of noise that we have seen over the last couple of days, and then today the president saying, well, we are not turning back on this.
In fact, the state of the handshake was clear today on when reactions from the handshake principle, one Raila Odinga and of course Kalonzo Musyoka and Musalia Mudavadi, their reaction to the speech by the president, and it was all like, yes, they were agreeing with him totally. We expect to hear a bit of a pana. He didn't say this, somebody should have said that. But after this State of the Nation address, their reaction and what they said to the media was, we agree totally with what he had said. In fact, one of the issues that Raila spoke about, and I'd like Robert, if you can hear me, was about the judiciary. And the president spoke about it during his speech, and Raila Odinga also spoke about it right outside Parliament. And if you can listen to that soundbite, Robert.
We need to ensure that corruption cases are heard and determined on a priority basis. Kenyans are waiting to see more convictions and far less cynical exploitation of court processes to protect a few.
Just investigate judiciary the way you investigate everybody else, so that if you find that there's a judge who is corrupt, a judge who is making some rulings which are biased because of bribes or commissions that have been given, and then he needs to deal with them. So nobody in this war should be above the law.
The judiciary, again, came up. Yeah. Remember during the conference, it came up and everyone was saying, oh, this and that about the judiciary, from the DPP to the DCI, and Chief Justice Maraga came up, and all the issues that are surrounding the judiciary. And this brings me to something that happened yesterday and today in terms of the case against Samburu governor. Where he was given 100 million shillings bail by Chief Magistrate Douglas Agoti. And there was a lot of noise about that, like that is too much, that is a lot of money. And he did an interview with the local daily, the magistrate, the Star, today. And because of that, he has actually had to recuse himself from that case, from listening to this case on Samburu, and he's now deferred it to Magistrate Lawrence Mugambi. It was because of the attack towards him by the lawyer of the senator, of the governor, urging the magistrate to recuse himself from the case, saying his views during that interview were going to affect his judgment on the case. So I'd like us to listen to Magistrate Ogoti on what he said today when he was recusing himself, and then we can continue with the discussion.
I have consulted my conscience, and it advises me not to handle any other issue concerning this matter, lest the accusations before me will continue unrelentlessly.
Haven't we had instances where people say someone has stolen 300 million and apatiwa bail ya milioni moja? It's not fair. So this guy, the case currently against the governor is for about 84 million, yeah. And the bail was set at 100 million. Of course, now it was reduced to 10 million and is free today. But that is one of the issues that comes up when people talk about corruption, and they keep accusing the judiciary of not doing its job. But when one magistrate does something like this, 100 million, most people are actually applauding it and say this is a precedent. This is the way to go.
Very interesting. And the judiciary has been attacked many times in different respects. But I wanted to just pick on and we'll come back to the judiciary. I know Shuri is waiting on the wings. But I wanted to bring in Linus on this question of the handshake and the opposition people being in parliament in the manner that they did. Linus, you have covered these sort of things for a long time. Things happening at Parliament, not just State of the Nation speeches. And today we saw the opposition leaders, if they can still be called that, in the Speaker's gallery being recognized at the start of the Speaker's speech and that sort of thing. And when they came out, they were all praises for the President's speech. In fact, Moses Wetangula wanted to disagree with something the President said, and he said we would encourage the President. And that is very, very interesting language. What would you say about how this handshake and whatever else is associated with this has affected the state of politics insofar as the adversarial sort of nature of our democracy has been since the return of multi-party politics?
I think since the return of multi-party politics, no president has enjoyed such a good space as President Uhuru Kenyatta is, politically speaking. You have all your opponents seated in the gallery. You have your opponents leading your government projects, launching Huduma centers, launching the NIMS number, that is the registration process. It can't be prettier than this. The closest we came to this was on the 18th of March, 2002, when President Moise Kanu merged with Raila Odinga's NDP to form the new Kanu. Basically, it obliterated the opposition. In the tradition of the State of the Nation speeches, there was supposed to be a response from the opposition. Here, where we are in the US, there's normally a response that will come from the opposition that will criticize and say this is what ought to happen. This is what the president should have addressed. But look at what we see in Kenya today, all the opposition figures supporting the president. The question now is, how is the president utilizing that space? He needs to know it's a window that can close, because it also goes with the public mood. If the public at one of these, at some point during this whole thing, starts getting tired that, okay, what is the benefit of the handshake? Because there's one clear benefit that the handshake has brought about, and that is peace. There's some national harmony. It's also guiding people to start thinking again as one nation, because we must all remember where the country came from in 2017 during the election and the repeat election, and new maps coming up suggesting that some sections of the country wanted to secede. These were serious issues that have been dealt with one blow, and that blow is the handshake. Now the president needs to move with speed to then put substance on what the handshake should deliver. Because if we went this way to the 2022 elections, then it lapses, then there will be no gain whatsoever on the part of the public.
All right, Yvonne?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to add the fact that with the handshake, it seems like there's a reversal of fortunes. The Jubilee members, some of them, are now speaking like the opposition, and those who are in, ODM are now speaking like they're in government. For instance, this morning on Daybreak, Wahiga Maura was hosting Alice Wahome, Member of Parliament for Kandara, and Gladys Wanga from Homa Bay. And I tell you, word for word, Gladys Wanga was actually articulating the housing part of the Big Four agenda, saying very similar things to what the president was saying about the housing, that a lot of those contracts for welding and doing windows and fabrications will be given to youth, will be given to locals. And she was so well articulating that position and defending the Big Four agenda, defending the president's war on graft. Alice Wahome was on the other end of it, questioning the handshake. Who is it for? Who does it benefit? I mean, it really was like she was in the opposition and Gladys Wanga. I thought that was just very interesting. I was watching it and it seemed like we were sort of in the twilight zone, and I think that is what is interesting. Even when you take a look at the reactions outside Parliament, they were literally falling all over themselves. I mean, like we were saying in the newsroom a little earlier, Moses Wetangula was encouraging the president before it would be that, this was not hard-hitting enough, this didn't go far enough.
Yvonne, it's interesting. Where do we get to know what was wrong with that speech? Because there must have been something that was wrong with that speech.
Look, you will not find, because this is how shifty our politics is. The moment a decision like the handshake was made, I mean, very few people have an idea how the handshake was arrived at. Probably the day the likes of Honorable Junet Mohammed watafungua roho waseme how they arrived at that handshake and how it was arrived at, and give us the finer details, maybe we'll continue to see all these squabbles that we see today. But the political ramifications of the handshake will continue to be felt until 2022 or even thereabout. Why? Because the handshake has effects, especially in the Jubilee team. Those allied to the Deputy President still feel, and that's why you will see the sentiments coming from Honorable Alice Wahome, that this handshake came to antagonize, to destabilize, to cause some situation in Jubilee. That is their feeling. On the other hand, the president is saying this handshake was required so that the country can stabilize and so that we can continue working and so that we can continue implementing the Big Four agenda and so on and so forth. So this handshake brought out the divisions even in Jubilee, where we were being told it's all rosy, it's all bromance, it's all happiness. This handshake has come to expose how dicey the political situation is, even in Jubilee. Even when you're told that things are very rosy there, they're not necessarily rosy. They are conveniently rosy. So when that convenience ends and another situation brings another convenience, the situation changes. And that's how dicey our political situation is.
Joe, you're talking about what could have been wrong about that speech, and no one has pointed it out. One of the ladies we were speaking in, she was in Mombasa, she said, mbona rais hajazungumzia watu kufa na njaa na nini na nini, because it was a big deal a couple of weeks ago. People were dying. Of course, there was a fake news whether people were dying or not, but that was one of the main issues that...
You mean claims of fake news?
There were claims of fake news, kwamba hizo picha tulikuwa tunaziweka hewani pengine sio za kweli, but that is one of the issues that we expect the president to speak a lot about, that exactly what has the government done. Yes, we had people who needed food, whether food has been delivered to people in Turkana and Baringo and West Pokot, in areas where they were in danger of starvation, because at this time the rains are not as they should be. we've not had the long rains as we expected it, and it's April already. So that's one of the things we wanted him to speak about. And also, I think the war on corruption also is an issue that I think should have been spoken on about a bit more, especially in terms of the push and pull that we have seen between what the president was saying and what his vice president was saying. You see, I think the president...
So sort of reining in the troops and saying, this is the direction we're going, everybody line up.
Everybody line up.
Line up, as someone...
Because you mentioned, remember that lunch? Remember the lunch that the president and the deputy president had, the publicized lunch? Because we know they probably meet all the time, but that was publicized. I'd expected maybe we'd have a third person in that lunch. I was thinking maybe we could have Raila Odinga there also with them during that luncheon, and maybe they could have, three of them would have stood at the steps of some building and said, hey, rein in all the troops, because people have been speaking all over at churches, at weddings, at funerals. Tumekuwa tukisikiza a lot of sound bites, and I was thinking maybe it would be up to them to stand and kusema watu waache kuzungumza.
Are you likely to see that?
I don't think so, but that's what I was expecting.
I mean, to Jamila's point, it was quite interesting. I mean, I was wondering what's going on in these people's minds as they sit there listening to the president, because these are the same people who've been saying that this war on corruption is really not genuine. This is a political thing. It is targeting the deputy president and that sort of thing. And the president is standing there saying there is no turning back. This thing is so important. Corruption is robbing our future generations of all manner of opportunities. So there's a sense in which this double speak, this people speaking at cross purposes within government could be undermining even the communication around the corruption thing, because there is what is happening and there's also what the public gets to think is happening.
Right.
We need to be taking a break, right?
Yes, but I'd like to just highlight a couple of things away from the politics of corruption and the handshake. You were talking about what's right with it. Africa Check, an organization that fact-checks what people say. And I'll just do this briefly, and you can check the rest on africacheck.org. They fact-checked a number of statements that the president made. Number one, our broad-based economic growth averaged 5.6 over the last 5 years. Africa Check termed this one as largely correct, and they give an explanation about it. Here's another one. In 2016, provisional estimates show the economy grew by 66.1%. The verdict from Africa Check, mostly correct. And a final one regarding housing. Over 175,000 Kenyans have already registered under the voluntary scheme known as Boma Yangu. The verdict from Africa Check, mostly correct. They will take a look at a lot more of what he said over the course of that 2-hour or so speech, africacheck.org. And I just think it's also important to look at those nitty-gritties, which sometimes can be a little tedious and a little boring for a lot of us to go through. But, you know, they do matter. Yes, and they do some interesting stuff. So just thought we would talk about what was correct. Yeah.
All right. So we will be taking a short break now, and we'll be right back.